Hello, YouTube. So just so everyone knows, we are attempting to do a multi-stream from on both the YouTube and the Facebook. Not sure exactly how it's going to work. If you are on the Facebook, know that it is very difficult for us to check questions on the Facebook, so please jump onto the YouTube stream. We're just trying to air it so that everyone can kind of get access. Let's see. All right. So for those of you who don't already know, I'm in the studio today with Kat Hamilton, who's here to discuss her paper, Practice Habits in the COVID-19 Pandemic. Paper, article, how would you like me to refer to it?
Article.
Article? Okay, article. So first, can everyone hear us okay? Are we getting sound? Yes, we are currently operating out of our future past. Okay, so we got sound. That's good. Let's see. So just a little housekeeping. Just some announcements, so people know. In the upcoming, we still are planning on having a virtual class on Friday. This week, we will probably be focusing on more of the Gemeinfechten things, and maybe we'll throw a little Messer in there depending on how much time it takes. We are going to have a in-person class on Saturday. We're going to be having the class in Marcus Garvey Park, up by the fire watchtower.
Yeah,
the bell at the top of the hill that I experienced for the first time this past Saturday. So there'll be another class. If you are in the Discord, we will be posting a link to sign up for that class. The class will be limited to 15 people. There will be a longsword section for starting around 11 a.m. That will go on for about 90 minutes, and then we will transition into a Messer class that will go on for about another 90 minutes or so. And we did this past weekend. We did a class, and I thought that went pretty well. We've been using rattan sticks instead of steel because of some insurance issues, and I think that's about it in terms of general housekeeping stuff. I'm trying to think what else. I can't think of anything. So, all right. Anyway, so it's about 5 after, which means it's probably about time to actually get started. And so what we're going to do is we're going to, first of all, actually, Kat, want to introduce Kat? So why don't you introduce yourself and a little bit about, you can introduce yourself and tell me a little bit about what brought you to write this article.
Sure. Kat, and I've been studying Hema since 2016. I also studied Toyama Ryu Bato Do. My background is primarily in music, but I also studied psychology. And so I have a little bit of experience in running simple studies, brief studies. So I became interested in practice habits because as a former musician, practice is a really common part of being a musician. Having good practice habits is how you make progress in your craft. And this actually happened after the AMA that you did with Tristan, where we were talking about mindful practice, and the Sword Class NYC Discord was just blowing up with everybody commenting on mindful practice. And a topic of conversation that came up in the context of mindful practice was musicianship practice. And there are a number of musicians in Hema. I'm just one of many, and so we all were discussing whether or not our musical backgrounds have any help or hinder factors when it comes to our sword practice. And so I originally started writing kind of a literature review type of article. I had started doing research into mindful practice and musicianship. But it wasn't really coming together to connect to the sword stuff. I was finding really good material on musicianship and mindfulness and practice, but not really sword. It was hard to relate that back to swords. So I decided to shift the focus to using musicianship as just one component, but the main focus being just straight up asking people in swords about their practice habits and trying to make connections from there. And so from musicianship and their physical activity and whether or not they came with any other prior martial arts practice. I know a lot of people take like taekwondo or karate when they're a kid, and I wanted to take a look at that since it would be a past practice, similarly to my musical background being at this point past practice.
So when you talk about practice and how, like, could you talk a little bit about the importance, like the important, because you, like you said, draw a lot of comparisons between practice for music and then also for martial arts. Could you talk about what that means? What does it mean to practice? What is your definition of practice? And then how, in your mind, do you equate those two things of like the musical practice and martial art practice?
So I consider practice to be any work that you're doing outside of normal class time. So for when I was a musician, I engaged in practice on my instrument outside of rehearsal time or any group settings. So if I knew that I needed to be rehearsing with the orchestra, or I was in a wind ensemble or any small chamber groups, even if it was just one or two other people, I needed to do a lot of practice on my own in order to take my part of things and learn it to the best of my ability on my own, and then incorporate it into what the group is doing, because the dynamic is different. Similarly to when we're in class together and we're doing paired techniques, that's going to be different than if I'm doing practice cuts on my own or looking at sources on my own. So I'm coming to either mental understanding or physical understanding through just doing the motion before I get to class, so that class time with a partner can be devoted to, now I'm making it work in context, whereas just straight up making it work is on my own, or at least in an ideal manner.
And so how then would you equate like the amount, I guess. Actually, let's talk a little bit about what were you, when you started this. You put together a Google poll. Was it like a form, Google form poll?
Yeah.
What were you expecting to find, and what did you find?
I think what I was expecting to find was actually darker and maybe more pessimistic than what I actually found, since I was focusing on people's practice habits outside of class before COVID, and then people's practice habits outside of what classes we have during COVID. I think I was maybe expecting that number to drop off. I know for myself personally, it's really difficult to find the time and space and motivation to do sword work, especially at the beginning when all of us were coping with being under a strict quarantine lockdown and not really being able to go even to the park as often as we would like. So being able to find the motivation, and I know a lot of people have significant others in their home, or roommates, pets, kids, and that makes it really difficult to practice. Whereas before, a lot of people would practice in the park, no problem. We could practice in the space before or after class, which I also would count as like what I refer to as capital P practice, which is not just playing around, but actually working. So we could practice outside of class, but in the space, and have a space to practice. So as we didn't have those spaces anymore, and maybe we're confined to quarters with more people, more objects, I was expecting to see that people's practice was going to drop off. But ultimately what I saw was that it didn't. It held steady. The same number of people who were practicing before COVID were continuing to practice. Likewise, the same people who were not practicing on their own at all before COVID are continuing to not do that. Not necessarily the same people, but the same percentage of people who were practicing or continuing to do so, which is hopeful in that we didn't let it get us down, but also gives us food for thought, because maybe we should be looking to practice more now that we don't have access to spaces as readily, and especially with Sword Class NYC going through its changes, we don't have access to that space in the same way. So it's just a nice like food for thought moment.
All right. So you have a deck kind of here. You brought a deck with you.
We did.
And so what I wanted to do was, would you like to go through some slides and talk about them a little bit?
Sure.
So first of all, let me see if I got. Okay, so let me go ahead and switch to the deck, and I'll do my best to keep us. All right.
Here you go.
On camera. All right. So, first things first. What are we? Yay, title card.
Yay.
Why don't you talk a little bit about what we're going to be looking at here?
Sure. This deck is where I've placed some graphs and charts that I figured would be good visual aids and they also appear in the article as written. And this is just a way that I chose to visually represent the data that I collected. So I asked, there were 67 people who responded to this. Thank you everyone who responded. It was really lovely to receive so many. And I took the 67 people who responded, all of their responses, and I broke all of that down into various categories and then made all sorts of charts and graphs to better visually represent the information so that I wouldn't have just 15 pages of words to have some pictures. So I took some of those graphs that I thought were good representation of the information and a good summation and put them into this slide deck so we could take a look at them and take a look at them together.
Okay. And actually, speaking of which, could you talk a little bit about where did you poll these questions and a little bit about who was all involved in that?
Sure. So I sent out this survey. The survey was 14 questions, which I sent out with as a Google form submission survey. I sent it out to my personal Facebook. I shared to the NIFA Facebook, the New York Batodo Facebook. I also sent it out to some email lists of various sword clubs that I'm in to capture the people who aren't on Facebook. And I also gave it to the Sword Class NYC Discord server group to try and get. What I wanted to get were as many respondents as possible across as many disciplines as possible. So I really wanted to be able to capture not only Hema and Iaido as two things that I study, but I really wanted to reach Kendo and any other sword arts, anything else that anybody is studying that they would want to respond and to hear about their experiences, because I also wanted to look at how the responses were different across different disciplines, not as a contest to see who practices the most, but as a way to...
But as a contest to see who practices the most.
Yeah, as a contest to see who wins. Who wins? Who wins the practice.
Sorry about that. All right. So shall we dive into it?
Yeah, let's go
all
for
right.
it.
Let's see. All right.
Yeah.
So why don't we start here and give me a little shakedown of what's going on?
Yeah, so one of the questions on the survey was which sword arts you currently study. I allowed people to select as few or as many as they wanted to put in there. For the most part, the majority of respondents only study one, but there were a certain percentage of people who do study two or more of the options listed. I did also allow people to put in their own as an open-ended, and a few people did. So I took that and I put it in the category other, just because there were maybe one person who responded per each of those things that they wrote in themselves. So I wanted to be able to capture them in this visual, but not clog it up. So of course we see the majority of the people who responded are in Iaido and Hema, which is not surprising because that's due to my network of people is mostly Hema and Iaido. But of course there is overlap with the Kendo folks, and of course at Sword Class NYC they have Kendo. So I was pleased to see a decent number of Kendo people who responded. There are of course people I know in Hema, and I'm sure in others that have a classical fencing background as well, and so a few of them responded, which was great. We had some people who say they do harness, amazing, and then there were a few other arts that they selected. But the bulk of what I'll end up talking about when we get to the sword art data is going to be Hema, Iaido, and Kendo, if only because they had the most people responding. But this graph is just a good visual representation of the number of people per art. This is double counting. So like if somebody said that, yes, I do Hema, and yes, I do Bato-do, then it's counting them twice.
Okay. Let's move on.
These were the non-sword activities that I focused on. So, of course, there was voice or musical instrument, musicianship, which is, of course, where I'm coming from. There are people who I asked them about studying another sport or another martial art before they came to swords. Got a lot of good responses here. There were a lot of people who said they did jiu-jitsu or boxing, karate, taekwondo, certain things that I can't even name right now because I didn't recognize them at all, which is fantastic. For voice and musical instruments for the musicians, I had a lot of people who responded with like, multiple instruments of study. For myself, multiple instruments of study, which became fun to break down later. And also one person said turntablism as their form of musical study, which I found to be really cool. So I didn't have that in the original survey. That, again, I allowed people to write things in if there was an option that they wanted that I didn't offer. I left it open-ended, and somebody put in turntablism, so like, good for you, turntable person. And then I also asked people about their general fitness. Do they exercise in the gym or at home, or right now probably at home? And just the kinds of activities that people engaged in for working out. There are people who do a lot of cycling or stationary cycling, people who do weightlifting. I know in Hema especially there are a lot of people doing weightlifting, powerlifting, so there were a decent number of responses there. So this is just the percentage breakdown of number of respondents, the percentage who do these other activities.
Okay. And so these were also, so what was your intent for this material? You were hoping to compare, you said mostly the musical instrument stuff, but why were you so concerned about like home, like gym use?
So instruments, musicianship was where I started with it, but as I got to thinking about whether or not musicianship would help or hinder practice habits, I thought about other forms of practice that like either I myself engage in or other people I know, and definitely exercise, going to the gym or working out at home is another form of practice, a consistency thing. And if they, especially a person had studied another sport or a martial art, that is also another form of practice. And also allows, for the martial arts one, allows me to do more of an apples to apples comparison on practice habits than maybe musicianship or working out. But I wanted to be able to capture those things and have other points to see if any of these things are helping or hindering people in their sword practice. So taking a look at, okay, this person says that they studied voice, and their practice habits when they studied voice were like this. And then their sword practice habits before COVID was like this. Their sword practice habits during COVID are this. And being able to compare how has that changed or stayed the same? Has it gotten worse? Has it improved? And to see if there are any correlations between somebody who studies a musical instrument, studies a musical instrument versus how they practice swords. So looking for if there are any major trends. Not necessarily reaching a definitive conclusion, such as anybody who studies the tuba is going to practice a lot, but being able to see if there are anything that trends positively or negatively in that direction.
Okay, let's move on.
So this was the breakdown of the musicians versus non-musicians data. So we can see in these graphs, I am looking at solo sword practice during COVID, solo sword practice pre-COVID, and just solo practice pre-swords. The solo practice pre-swords referring to what their practice habits were in any of the anything that they may have done, any learning experiences. What were their practice habits like? So in general, there was a slight trend towards people with musical training being more likely to practice on their own outside of class. It wasn't as extreme as I would have thought. Anytime you're doing any kind of study with people, you're going to have preconceived notions about what's going to happen. You're going to have expectation. And I really wanted to try to look at the data without major expectation, but I think that was maybe being a musician myself, had expectation that the practice habits of a musician, knowing how hard I used to practice, would maybe translate over. But then I saw, and it was only slight, and then I had to think about my real true experience on entering Hema, and if I practiced Hema as hard as I used to practice my instruments, and the answer is no. So no, that does not necessarily translate over, but it was slight. It was a slight positive correlation that someone with musical training would be slightly more likely to practice swords on their own than somebody who does not have musical training.
Okay. Is there anything else you'd like to say about this slide before we move on?
Only that in kind of a in wanting to make a quip, I spent many hours crunching data to see which instrument practices swords the most, so which kind of instrumentalist or vocal musician practices swords the most. And pre-COVID, it was brass and percussion people. Anybody who studied brass and percussion, they all said that they practiced swords pre-COVID. But post-COVID, they were some of the worst. The people who practice swords on their own the most during COVID were the violinists and the pianists that definitely spent a lot of time crunching numbers for something that was really mostly a joke. 'Cause I'm a woodwind musician, and there's a reputation there about being a type A perfectionist. So I wanted to see if it's true. It's not. We're not practicing the most.
I am sorry that you the woodlands let you down there.
Yeah.
So next up, I see gym rats.
Gym rats. I opted to use this label rather than fitness enthusiasts or just fit people because I think it's funny. And also, anybody who practiced swords with me at Sword Class NYC has seen me come in with literally a half-gallon jug of water. That's my water for class, which I may or may not share with my husband. But and everybody referred to it as my gym rat jug. So in honor of my gym rat jug, I named this Gym Rats. Much love to gym rats. I also work out at home pretty regularly, so also technically gym rat. So for the gym rats, it was similar to the musicianship that pre-COVID, people who work out are slightly more likely to practice swords outside of class pre-COVID. Where that number changed a lot is during COVID, there was, I think, like a 25% drop in solo practice for the non-gym rats. So it became that the gym rats were way more likely to practice swords outside of class during COVID. I think their number actually went up. So the gym rat people, the percentage increase from pre-COVID swords to during COVID swords, I think went up like 6%, and the non-gym rats went down by almost 25%.
Oh wow, that is. I mean, one can make a lot of assumptions about what that may or may not mean, but it definitely is an indicator that people who like to work out are going to find a way to keep working out.
Yeah, that's pretty much the conclusion that I had to reach. That we can't really draw too many definitive conclusions from the data because at a certain point it goes outside of the scope of what I was asking. But yeah, that's the general conclusion, is that people who are, I think, more motivated to work out on their own are going to be more motivated to practice swords on their own. Because for me, too, I tend to throw sword practice into my normal workout rotation. So like when I work out in the mornings, maybe sometimes instead of, doing ab day or like a weightlifting like arm day, maybe instead I'm going to go to the park and train. And that just becomes part of my daily workout routine, rather than I've done my daily workout and now I'm going to carve out additional time for swords. That happens on some days personally, but I do often swap that into my workout rotation, so that's a factor. But again, can't really draw too many definitive conclusions on the data we have, but I can say that there's a positive correlation there for sure.
I think the one question everyone wants to know is Pizza Rat included in this gym rat
Of
survey?
course. Of course, Pizza Rat is a gym rat. Otherwise, how can Pizza Rat consume so much pizza and still look so good?
We actually have some comments coming in from Dylan. I think the hard thing for me was transferring practice is having an idea of what's right. But as I say, what is right is following is like following a North Star. Music, at least I know what something's supposed to sound like, even if I can't achieve it. There's a lot of Hema stuff. I often have no idea what direction I'm going in without a teacher's guidance. A lot of this is probably social exposure to how a violin or what you have is supposed to sound like, whereas I'm far less familiar with what good swordsmanship looks like. Yes. Yeah. I think that's a really interesting point. It really kind of we must always kind of consider good practice, bad practice, and somewhere in between practice, right? Like it's a little easier to communicate C note and transmit that over, say, like YouTube, than it is to say, this is Oberhau. Make your Oberhau gooder. I'm watching all of you. But it is hard. It's a little hard. Like it's a little harder to, and not just with Hema, but I think this is something also with like dance. It is very difficult to communicate physicality and like the details. I mean, you can do broad stroke things. I think that's a number of my friends who are professional dancers are talking about how they find the kind of online phenomenon of like, oh, I'm going to learn how to do this type of dance on a YouTube video. But they tend to be more broad stroke. They're not dances that require. They're more like disco, like not disco dancing, but like something you do at discotheque, versus something they're like ballet dancers or they're kind of like fine art dancers. You can't get into the nitty gritty of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Sorry, rambling aside. Let's see.
This is the breakout of the martial artists. Now I know that as fencers, I know I consider myself a martial artist, but I'm making the distinction here, if only for ease of needing to type this over and over and over again, and for you to read it over and over again. I opted to say that participants with previous martial arts experience, I'm just referring to them as martial artists. And participants with no previous martial arts experience, I'm referring to as the non-martial artists. This is not any kind of commentary on whether or not sword stuff is martial arts. This is just for ease of transmitting the information and for you to receive the information. But similarly to musicianship, pre and post, I'll say post-COVID, it's during COVID, pre and during COVID, the martial artists were slightly more likely to practice swords on their own than the non-martial artists. There were no big jumps from pre-COVID to during COVID. It all stayed pretty similar across the board, maybe like slight increases here and there. But especially when you look at the various categories of like never, once a month or less, a few times, like people for the most part are continuing to hold steady. And I think that's similar to maybe the like in terms of the gym rats and the musicians, that if you have a habit of practicing something, you're more likely to keep practicing. And for the martial artists, it wasn't really that surprising to me that they continued to practice through COVID and that they were practicing a decent amount. The majority of people who said that they have previous martial arts experience said that they did some form of practice. I'm not even necessarily talking about like every single day or 5 times a week, just something. They were more likely to have done that much, and then that just held steady heading into COVID. It was just already in their rotation.
It's interesting, all the categories, including previous martial artists, musicians, gym rats, and you talked a little bit about this before. It's all about the idea of practice as habit. Habit is the key word, I think, in the title that you've been talking about, and we can talk a little bit more about that towards the end, because I want to make sure we get through all of your slides today.
So this is the variances in all of the data. So I'm looking at all of the groups: the musicians, non-musicians, gym rats, non-gym rats, martial artists, and the non-martial artists. which I've abbreviated as MA and NMA, because in typing it was very cumbersome to keep typing non-martial artists over and over again. So I've abbreviated that here so you guys know what we're talking about. And so I was looking at the percentage of any kind of practice in these groups. So that could be practice every day or practice like once every now and then. It's still counting as practice. Looking at it pre-COVID and during COVID, and then looking at the variance to see if there were any big changes. And as we mentioned on the gym rat slide, the biggest changes were in the gym rats and non-gym rats, from pre-COVID solo practice to during COVID solo practice. And you can see that 25% drop in the non-gym rats. So pre-COVID, 81% of the non-gym rats said that they were practicing some amount. During COVID, only 56% of the non-gym rats are saying that they practice any amount. Those were the only major variances there. Everywhere else, it was pretty slight. I mean, the musicians and the non-musicians, you see 3% change, not that big a deal. You see a 4% change in the martial artists and non-martial artists, not that big of a change. In the article itself, I highlighted the gym rats and non-gym rats because there were variances of over 5% in either direction. So you see the gym rats increased by 6%, the non-gym rats decreased by 25%.
Ooh.
So both of those are highlighted to call that out. But really, in looking at that, the biggest, of course, is the non-gym rat data. So the people who don't tend to work out on a regular basis also don't tend to practice swords now that it's COVID.
Right. That's a big jump. That's a cool. We actually have a question. Dina asks, did you consider asking how long someone has done their sword art to see if, for instance, those who have done it longer have better practice as noobs or vice versa?
I hadn't thought about asking that. That would have been an interesting question to ask, just especially once I started crunching the numbers. There were a whole slew of questions that I wish I had asked. And that maybe will be a write-up for another blog post for another time and what I would do differently. But that was actually something that I thought of afterwards and not before. Because, that could very well be that somebody who's been practicing longer might be more likely to practice more. I know as I've practiced longer, I've been more likely to practice more, just as anecdotal, personal. There might also be people who they've been practicing a long time and they don't feel like they have to practice at all. It would have been interesting to find out, but maybe that'll be a follow-up at a later date. That was one of the things I thought of as rats.
Yeah, and it's I mean, we looking back, it's always a hindsight, right? I would be very interested in it also because it feeds back. Dina's question kind of relates to what Dylan was talking about a little bit, in so much that there was the idea that how does one know, like during that practice, like how do I know I'm doing X, Y, Z correctly? And I always find it interesting because I've had actually a number of students ask about how can we improve solo practice, and it's been mentioned that there's some stuff on Sword Squash, and I have some stuff for another class session and some other interviews that we can probably do with people. But it is always like, how do I know I'm doing blank correctly? How do I know I'm the check-ins, right, are always very difficult. Looking forward to another article. You put it out in the universe, now you gotta do it.
Yeah, now I gotta do it. I said it, now I gotta do it. So this is the just general variances across everything. So looking at any kind of sword practice pre-COVID, any kind of sword practice post-COVID. So this isn't any particular group. This is the total number of respondents. So looking at what everybody said they did in terms of practice pre and post-COVID. So it's stayed exactly the same, identical, as we talked about at the beginning. The people who were practicing before are still tending to practice. The people who weren't practicing before are not. Not necessarily the same people, but definitely that'll actually we'll talk about that when we get to the sword arts slide, because there's an interesting in the non-gym rat data that negative 25%, there is an interesting offsetting increase that may account for this very, very much identical, like carryover.
Okay. Shall we move on?
Yeah.
Oh, wait.
Yep.
That's the one, right? Variances by Sword Art?
Yeah.
Okay.
Variances by Sword Art. So I know that this was something that I was really interested in looking at once I had gone through all the other numbers. Okay, what does it look like in each sword art? So I'm isolating Hema, Iedo Batodo, and Kendo since they had the most respondents, and there was a lot of overlap in people who studied Hema, and then also like other and also with these categories, other things that were in that other category that maybe had one respondent. So in looking at the pre-COVID and during COVID data, the Hema and Iaido people, exactly the same. This is looking at any form of practice. So 77% of Hema people did some form of practice pre-COVID, and 77% of the Hema people are doing some kind of practice during COVID. Similarly for Iaido Batodo, 85% of people were doing something pre and now are doing something during. Where we see a really large variance is in the Kendo. The Kendo folks, pre-COVID, only 69% of them were doing any form of practice. And during COVID, that has gone up to 92%, and it's a 23% increase.
Wow. Okay.
Yep.
Did you have any indicator about why that was the case, or were you just collecting raw data?
Just collecting raw data. Yeah, the unfortunate part is anything that might be an indicator of why isn't captured by this. It's kind of outside the scope. I mean, I know anecdotally that the people who study Kendo at Sword Class NYC, they have a little Kendo and coffee thing on Sunday mornings, and I know that they're doing Zoom classes. But other than knowing that anecdotally, I didn't capture anything of that nature in this study because it was kind of outside of the scope of what I was looking at. But it is a really interesting corresponding positive leap when you consider the 25% of non-gym rats who that number went down for solo practice. So having that might be a factor in why those numbers have carried so straight across in the practice for COVID versus pre-COVID versus COVID.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Dylan comments, for me, Kendo Zoom classes were free, and I could make more of them. Scheduling. Yep. Okay, that is yeah. I mean, I would be very interested because I mean, good on everyone else for maintaining numbers, but really good on the Kendo folks for having that's a 23% increase in attendance. I'm a little jealous.
Yeah, I can't remember if I tossed this graph in the slide deck. It might be the next one if it's in this deck.
No, I think that's our last slide.
No, but for the Kendo folks. In looking at the amount of practice breakdown, so every day, a couple times a week, once a month, the Kendo people, that was the only sword art that pre-COVID responded, no one responded that they practice every day. None. 0% practice every day. Whereas the Hema and the Iaido folk did have some people who said that they practice every day. But then when you look at the during COVID data, I think it went up to like 6% of the Kendo people say they practice every day now.
Oh, wow.
And this is the part that was really encouraging, was that there was that leap there, that while I was encouraged by the fact that the amount of practice stayed the same and didn't go down across the board. That was really, really encouraging. But what was even more encouraging was that there was a group that is practicing more. They're practicing more. And who knows, maybe it's just the nature of what the equipment that the Hema folk and the Iaido Batodo people have, that they can't really practice as consistently on their own, or the Zoom classes that the Kendo folk are doing, maybe just the times are better for people in general, or maybe because Kendo is a little bit more of a workout, maybe that being their only workout, they want to be able to do that more. It's difficult to say because that is outside the scope. But it was really encouraging to see that there was a group that increased their practice by a quarter.
Yeah. So does kendo have forms to use as a structure for practice? I am not an expert in kendo, so I am. I know they have forms, and I know they have structured practices, but I don't know if it's a universal thing, and that's also based on my very limited attendance of kendo classes throughout my life. But if also the larger question there is, are we going to be having forms and structure in our future Hema classes? The answer is yes. But yeah, I think that actually brings up a really good point, is methodology of teaching and methodology of class structure. One of the things that we always talk about is how Hema really relies on that partnered drilling system, which is not necessarily always, say, the most efficient way to practice, but it is a way of practicing. And that has been one of our major challenges in the COVID times, is trying to figure out a way that we can do these things.
Yeah.
Mostly isolated, similar. I assume forms are more common in Soul and Dobop than Kendo. Yes, I know that Kendo does have, yes, but Kendo definitely does have kata sets.
Yeah.
And I think it also depends on which federation you're, like, has it, because there's a couple different Kendo federations, and they have anyway, I'm not an expert. I don't want to drop.
Me neither. No Kendo experts here at the moment.
So that being said, here, let me click over. Let's if we're done reviewing these, let's go full screen.
Full screen.
Or at least for the non-Facebook folks, we'll be going full screen. Sorry, Facebook folks. So with all that, is there anything that, any other comments that you wanted to make, or anything you wanted to kind of say towards, about the research itself?
Another thing that I had asked people about was if they could add something to their home practice, what would that be? And a lot of people said tameshigiri, test cutting. And I said, wouldn't it be nice? I definitely do not have tall enough ceilings or enough space in my apartment to do any kind of test cutting. I don't particularly want to soak tatami in my bathtub and then cut it in my house.
Right.
But that and paired practice, I think maybe the Hema folk were asking that would love to do more paired practice, but unless you live with someone who practices or can convince your roommate or your dog to help you, that's unlikely. But a lot of people said that they would like to incorporate more conditioning training, more cardio, more strength training, footwork was definitely something, and these are all things that would be fairly easy to incorporate. And this is something that I think is an advantage, and I talked about this a little bit in my article. This is a thing that I believe to be our advantage in practicing sword arts over what I used to have to do as a musician. When I was practicing my instrument, I had to physically have my instrument in my hands. I needed to go through all of my scales and tone exercises and warm-ups and practice whatever piece I was working on for all the groups that I was in, and it wasn't really something that I could watch a video of a teacher doing kata and be able to do it. Like, I couldn't watch someone playing the flute and say, like, yes, I understand that now. I had to actually it was very structured. I had to sit and just do it. But for swords, I think it's really easy to take other things that you're doing and apply kind of a sword mindset to it. That is something that came up when we did the mindfulness yoga, and we've talked about just mindfulness in swords. But you can take that mindset and apply it to other things. So, for example, when I do yoga, there is a lot of overlap in sword footwork or posture and things that I like to take. And when I'm working on yoga, I can approach it with a sword mindset, and I consider that a form of practice of swords. I would not be able to do that with a flute or an oboe. It just wouldn't work that way. Can't really approach yoga with I guess you could, maybe for breathing, approach with a flute mindset. Where there's a way, I guess. Being able to approach that, or saying, like, okay, I want to increase my my stamina for when I finally get to spar with my friends again. I'm just going to do a whole bunch of cardio with a mask on, so that I can increase my stamina. So there are lots of other ways that we can engage in meaningful practice that aren't necessarily swinging around a sword, because I think for a lot of people that's not as possible because of their space constraints, especially space constraints.
Yeah, space constraints, especially for folks in the city, us folks in the city. Well, thank you. And where can people read your article?
I have posted it to langusmesser.com, where it's in a blog post form where you can click through and read the PDF. Since it was just so long and full of so many charts and graphs, I couldn't really post it in blog post form, but there is a link to the PDF on langusmesser.com.
Great. Fantastic. So we have just about 10 minutes left. And so what I want to do now is kind of open up the floor to folks to see if there are any questions or comments out there about any of the presentation they've seen so far. And also to open the floor a little bit, if you are a student of mine, or a sword student in general of any discipline, what are things you would like to see in some of our online classes and are now increasingly frequent in-person classes? Aside from Tamashigiri, can't do that yet. Sorry. And if you think I can set that up online, then I can't help you. Let's see, did we miss anything? Does Kendo form? Kendo seem? Oh yeah, interesting since Kendo seems more sparring paired work. Yeah, they're definitely. I have a Kendo book somewhere, but also these are good questions to pop on the Facebook page or the Discord. I'm sure folks will have. Yeah. You can ask, what were some of the other questions you realized you wish you would have asked?
Definitely the length of time that someone has been studying their sword art. Also, this was something that Josh had brought up to me, was how long it has been since they studied an instrument or had studied another martial art. Or dancing or anything like that. Was it 2 years ago, or is it current? Is it a current form of study? Is it something that they did when they were 8 and now they're 40? So looking at how long ago was it that they engaged in this other activity, and would that time and distance have affected things? If somebody who studied karate 10 years ago, what does their practice look like versus somebody who maybe studied a martial art just 2 years ago? So that was definitely one that was like, well, that would have been nice to know. That would have been extra information that could have produced some interesting answers. I also wished that I had maybe, I don't know if this would have been possible or if I could have done this in some other way, but in looking at the sword arts that people study, sorting through to see what people put as their primary, secondary, tertiary, if they have one, because the way that the form worked, it just dumped all of the responses into the same cell, so I wasn't really able to see which one they would have chosen as their primary, because maybe somebody who, like, Hema is their primary, maybe their practice looks different than somebody who also studies Hema, but Kendo is their primary. So I had wished that I had thought to do that, or thought to try and find a way to do that, because it also would have been interesting. In the end, I think I did get the kind of zoomed out big picture data that I wanted to get. But there were all sorts of little nuggets that would have been nice to have, if only just to say that we have them and to explore further later on. Definitely wished I had maybe asked the Kendo people more, or like more tried to delve into more what could those factors be. I did ask people what kinds of forms of of solo practice they're engaging in, and if they're attending any in-person meetups, or if they're attending Zoom classes. But maybe there could have been a way that I could dig for more information on that in terms of what kinds of practice, especially since now we're asking what are some of the things that maybe Kendo people are able to practice versus everybody else. Yeah, I see Dylan says follow-up study. Yeah, follow-up study. Maybe let some time pass. I think it would be interesting to follow this up when things have settled, when, you know, the whole COVID situation has not necessarily gone away, but improved to where we're having more consistent classes, either in a space or in the park. It would be interesting to do a follow-up to maybe capture these questions that I missed the first time around, but also to see how things change in a post-COVID practice environment. So I do think I would like to do a follow-up at some point in the future. Maybe not necessarily right now, but maybe like at the start of the year, the new year, and see where we stand. 'Cause I do have more I would like to find out.
Joe asks, it sounds like the average amount of solo practice didn't change outside of Kendo, but did the average person's amount of solo practice change, whether more or less?
Not really. I think the average person's amount of solo practice stayed fairly regular. There were, of course, little variances. This was a product of, again, in like hindsight, what I would have done differently. The way that I built the during COVID question, I accidentally left out some of the amount of time questions versus the pre-COVID questions. So I think what I left out was the options that I left out, which were, I think, once a month or a few times a month, I think didn't get captured. It was one of those options. I don't even necessarily think it was I forgot. I think when I was building it, I had a very clear idea in my mind why I didn't think I needed them, and then sent it out to everyone, started getting responses, and went, what was I thinking? I needed to have this in order to have an apples to apples comparison of pre and post COVID. What are you doing? So yeah, for the most part, it looked like the average person's amount of practice did change, but it's hard for me to say for sure because I kind of shot myself in the foot with how I decided to collect that data. So I think when I do a follow-up, I'll probably recollect that data, just to allow myself the chance to have a true apples to apples comparison, which instead I got apples like to kumquats or something out of it.
Sounds like a fantastic smoothie in the works. All right. So we got just a couple more minutes. Any other lingering questions out there? Yeah, I mean, as with anything, you know, hindsight 2020. But let's never say 2020 ever
We don't
again.
use that phrase anymore. The phrase is banned.
Oh my. Yeah. So I guess I mean you've contributed a few articles so far to the Long Semester blog. Is there anything you're currently working on?
For the moment, no. Taking a little break from the data, and I do have ideas for more I would like to do for the blog. It's definitely been fun to contribute, and I tend to like to take things that I'm interested in and expand upon them. So I have a couple of different ideas in the works that I'd like to do. I definitely want to do more yoga for you guys at some point, since I had a lot of fun doing the mindfulness yoga, and I have a few ideas for more yoga at some point. So I'd like to work on that. But in terms of semi-scientific study and data collection, I'm taking a little break from that because it was a lot of work and a lot of Excel work, a lot of Excel spreadsheets, a lot of me crying or screaming at Excel for not doing what I wanted it to do. But ultimately, I had a lot of fun doing it. I really appreciate everyone participating, and I hope that by doing this, the timing of the release of it, which was entirely coincidence with the announcement from Sword Class NYC about what they're doing moving forward. But I hope that in having this information to know that we're all doing okay and that there is the opportunity for growth, like we've seen with the respondents who do kendo, that's hopeful to me, that even in the face of our space closing, or changing form, I guess I should say, that we're still gonna be okay and be able to handle practice. And I do think that if you're gonna learn to practice on your own, now's the time. Not everybody can make it to Saturday classes in Manhattan. I get that, it's tough, but the fact that there are classes is hopeful, but also the fact that maybe we're gonna be okay to practice on our own if we can't make it to class too. That's I think an awesome thing. So I hope that this has brought some hope and comfort in this time.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for appearing on the live stream and for preparing this and writing this. I think I'm hoping it does bring that, like you said, that hope and hopefully a little motivation too. We got another question popping in. What do you think we should be looking to do now to step our indoor solo practice to make the most of it over the winter, now that our school won't be open for us to practice? And do you have any thoughts? Or do you want me to field this, or what do you?
I think what I said, for my part, what I said before about bringing a sword mindset to other forms of practice. So if you're doing yoga, you're working out, bring swords to that. I think I also mentioned in my article, if you're chopping vegetables for dinner, bring swords to that. If you're walking your kids to the park, bring swords to that. You can do footwork stuff. There's plenty of things that you can do to step up your practice, I feel, that isn't necessarily a sword in hand. Reading, I remember someone wrote this to me after I had my injury last summer, and it was likely that I wasn't going to be able to practice swords for a while physically, because my face was so swollen and I couldn't wear a fencing mask, and I was so badly concussed I shouldn't have been fencing anyway. But somebody told me that just because you can't practice right now, it doesn't mean you can't study your sources. And at the time, I was like, way to rub it in. But now I kind of understand that a bit more, in that I think it's a good opportunity to read our sources and take a look at that, try to practice stuff the best you can.
Yeah, practice, especially in Hema, means many things, right? I think also in terms of, I definitely give swords to the kids.
Yeah, give swords to the kids, yes.
Remember, daggers are swords for babies. That is a Dina-ism, I believe. I think one thing that, like you talk about hopefulness, one thing that has been really great to see is also how our community continues to be a community. The Discord is very, very active. There's, and people show up to classes and people attend digital classes. We're all here to help each other, encourage, and find these different ways of practice. And everyone, the most difficult part now is is like you said, how do we make sword practice happen with these challenges, moving forward, even like beyond the initial pandemic, hopefully first wave, maybe only wave of pandemic. I'm not going to get into it. As we come in the winter, it's going to be, okay, wear your fencing jacket, but you're going to also want to maybe wear a jacket. And we're still going to have to practice outside, if it's too cold, you just don't get the practice, or you have to get the right jacket. It's going to be about, hopefully, knock on wood, things get better and we'll be able to move things inside. And even if I can't talk too much about it, but there are going to be Dylan adds to the pile capes for winter. I agree, capes. I just think we should all have capes. Yes. I want to see what's that company that makes like the $1,000 Antarctica jackets?
Oh yeah.
I want to see their cape. I want to see them make like a bougie cape. Anyway, I can't talk too much about it right now because things are still in the works. But I can promise there are going to be options moving forward, and with for a place to practice at. It's going to be I think that it will be how things are going in the world era of COVID is going to determine some of that. But we are working on some solutions to make a space for us to practice that can shelter us from the elements. So some type of practice yurt, really. No, but in all seriousness, things are. I want to let everyone know that things are not stagnant. Things are moving forward, and things are happening. And there's a lot of really dedicated and smart and able people working to make that happen. So please be patient. I know everyone's patience has been so exhausted over the past few months. But as things are moving forward, it's just more patience.
And think about how dramatic and beautiful it'll look for all of us to be in our fencing jackets in a light snow.
Yes, as the ice freezes over our masks. Maybe the bind will finally work with fetters if it's too cold.
If we put a little water on there and let it freeze, it'll finally work.
Yeah, finally does Abschneiden really work? No. All right. Let's see. Let's make use of the weather while we have it, but prepare for when we won't. I agree. Yeah. I think also. I really am looking forward to see how things go. Again, thank you so much. That's about all the time we have for today. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining us. Join us on Friday for the Friday longsword class, or longsword/messer class. There might actually be some rapier options opening up in the near future, and some sword and buckler stuff. So, but we will talk about that at another time. So also, as a note for the Zoom, like the digital version of the class, we might be moving off the Zoom platform into a Google Meet situation. It's just going to be easier for me to manage some of that and also record some of that. So I'll let people know as soon as possible once those things are ironed out. And if anyone has any questions, comments, or concerns, please contact me. And Kat, tell everyone again where they can read your article.
You can read it on langusmesser.com.
So we'll post the link, and is there a place people can get in touch with you in case they have questions?
Yes, you can contact me on the Sword Class NYC Discord. You can also email me. My email is just myname68@gmail.com. So you can just email me if you have questions. And if you need any encouragement, if you want like a senpai or just an accountability buddy, you just need to talk to someone about your practice, you can definitely just email me or contact me on Discord, and I am available and around. I know Peter is available and around, so reach out to someone if you want help to take your practice to the next level, especially since we need to do that to prepare for winter if we need to.
You just want to see that Hema number go beyond the jump.
Yeah, I just want Hema to win. Gonna win the practice.
All right, everyone. Again, Kat, thank you so much for joining me, and thank you all for joining us for this live stream. We got to go win that practice, so let's make it so. All right. Have a great night, everyone, and talk to y'all soon. Bye. We're popping back in for one last thing.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, you thought it was over. You were wrong. So, Dylan made a new t-shirt, of which I will post a link to on all the social medias and in the Discord. I don't have the file in front of me on the video switcher, otherwise I'd put it up on screen. But yes, Dylan made a new shirt. You should go check it out. Actually, I'm going to post the link right now, because that I believe I have.
Dylan, it is not awful. I think it is glorious. It's a beautiful shirt.
Where was that posted, in the general?
Arts and Creations. Arts and Creations.
Okay.
Yeah.
So hold on, I'm getting the link now.
Yes.
Copy. How does anything on the internet work? Yeah. All right. So on both the Facebook and the YouTube, I have now posted a link. Let me actually see if I can pull up this graphic. It's just too good not to show people.
It's a work of art. It's beautiful.
It's truly something that it has to be seen. Why is hold on, I am always bad at the internet, so please remember that. Here we go. Actually, do I have it? Yeah. Yes. Okay. Hold on. Please hold on to your butts, everyone. I promise it's worth it. Hold on. Let's see if I click the thing. If I had any type of foresight, I would have just known that this needed to happen, and I could have just posted it or had this prepared.
In the meantime, I hope you guys are all doing okay. You're practicing hard.
All right, here we go. All right, everyone.
So good.
Go ahead and... Oh, that only worked on the one. So please hold. Yeah. Okay. There we go. I don't know how any of this works. What is... Hold on a second. I thought I got this to work, and it did not. It lied to me.
It's a liar.
It's really my fault. I don't know how to use these things. And I'm just bad at shameless self-promotion. I'm trying to get better at it. All right, everyone. Here it is. Now that anticipation. All right, boom. There we go.
Yeah.
There's our new shirt. For up on the Squinting Rabbit. And as Dina said, it's also available as other swag, such as pins and coffee mugs,
Masks.
face masks.
Yeah.
So yeah, check it out. SquintingRabbit.threadless.com. All right, for real this time. Going to say goodnight and good practice, everyone. Bye-bye.